In the autumn of 1941, the North Atlantic convoy system was already operating close to its structural limits. Merchant traffic from Halifax to the British Isles moved under rigid schedules, fixed cruising speeds, and escort allocations calculated weeks in advance. Convoy HX-112 was one such formation, assembled around predictable assumptions. Average merchant speed below 10 knots, escort fuel margins measured in days rather than weeks, and a threat model that ranked German submarines primarily by recent attack activity. Within that framework, U-96 was assessed as ineffective, not destroyed, not defeated, simply unlikely to matter. U-96 was a Type 7C submarine, displacing approximately 769 tons surfaced, driven by twin diesel engines for surface operations and electric motors powered by lead-acid battery banks when submerged. Its submerged endurance was finite and unforgiving. At 4 knots, battery capacity allowed roughly 80 nautical miles before recharge became unavoidable. At higher speeds, that distance collapsed rapidly. These physical limits defined everything the boat could and could not do. From the perspective of Allied escort analysts, those limits translated into expectation. A submarine constrained by battery cycles was assumed to seek early engagement or disengage entirely. Prolonged restraint was interpreted as incapacity. This interpretation shaped how U-96 was handled operationally. Early contact reports did not indicate aggressive maneuvering or radio transmissions. No torpedo tracks were observed. No sudden course changes forced escorts into action. In convoy threat matrices, U-96 drifted downward in priority. Escort command logic favored suppression of active contacts. Passive ones consumed fuel and attention without producing measurable results. The technical anchor here was logistics. Destroyers escorting HX-112 operated under strict fuel constraints. High-speed anti-submarine maneuvers increased consumption exponentially. Sustained pursuit of a non-attacking submarine was considered wasteful. What that logic failed to account for was time as an active variable. U-96's commander treated endurance limits not as a countdown to action, but as a planning boundary. The boat remained surfaced beyond visual range, exploiting night conditions and weather interference that degraded radar effectiveness. Sea clutter and atmospheric conditions reduced surface contact reliability. Battery charge was preserved. The submarine maintained contact without revealing intent. Silence was not absence. It was discipline. HX-112's escort screen relied heavily on ASTIC systems optimized for submerged targets within defined speed and depth envelopes. These systems lost effectiveness against surface contacts and became unreliable when escorts maneuvered aggressively. The convoy's defense assumed that submarines would attempt penetration, trigger detection, and be driven off. U-96 did none of these things. It remained outside the expected engagement geometry, tracking convoy speed and zigzag intervals imposed by doctrine rather than reacting to escort movements. The technical constraint shaping this phase was detection physics. Sensors could not see what doctrine assumed would be there. As the convoy progressed eastward, pressure mounted elsewhere. Other U-boats in the region generated confirmed contacts. Escort assets were pulled toward visible threats. Command bandwidth narrowed. Reports were compressed, categorized, and prioritized. U-96, still inactive by conventional metrics, remained classified as low threat. This classification was not an error in observation. It was an error in interpretation. The system measured activity, not persistence. The decisive phase did not begin with an attack. It began with alignment. U-96 maneuvered into an intercept position derived from convoy speed, heading, and formation behavior. Merchant ships in HX-112 varied in handling characteristics, forcing periodic adjustments that rippled through the formation. Escorts compensated by tightening their screen, reducing lateral coverage. The physical anchor here was inertia. Large merchant hulls could not alter course quickly without risking collision. Predictability increased as flexibility decreased. When torpedoes were finally launched, their immediate effect was secondary. The primary impact was systemic. Escorts accelerated toward perceived firing points. Formation coherence degraded. Reaction protocols activated automatically. Destroyers committed to suppression patterns that drew them away from convoy control. These responses were governed by procedure and physics. Engines required time to reach higher revolutions. Sonar operators needed stabilized platforms. Depth charge attacks demanded setup. Each step consumed time U-96 had already accounted for. HX-112 disintegrated not because defenses were absent, but because they were predictable. U-96 did not exceed its technical limits. It operated entirely within them. Battery endurance, sensor blind zones, and escort reaction times intersected in a narrow window that doctrine did not recognize as dangerous. The convoy collapsed as a result of interacting constraints rather than a single tactical failure. In the weeks that followed, after-action analysis began to reconstruct what had happened. When timelines were plotted against fuel states, sensor coverage, and estimated battery cycles, U-96's restraint appeared deliberate rather than ineffective. Silence aligned with endurance management. Delay aligned with escort fatigue and fuel economics. The technical anchors had been visible all along. They had simply been discounted. At the operational level, HX-112 forced a reassessment of threat classification. Contacts were no longer evaluated solely by attack frequency. Persistence within convoy proximity became a risk indicator. This shift acknowledged that physical limits shape behavior more reliably than intent. A submarine conserving energy could remain lethal longer than one that attacked prematurely. Strategically, the episode exposed a broader vulnerability. Convoy systems optimized for efficiency become brittle when adversaries exploit the cost of certainty. Escort command could not maintain continuous pressure on every contact without exhausting fuel and crews. Gaps were inevitable. U-96 demonstrated how to operate inside those gaps without triggering alarms. By 1942 and 1943, improvements in radar, air coverage, and coordination narrowed the spaces submarines could exploit. These adaptations required resources and time. HX-112 belongs to the phase before adaptation fully took hold, when systems were efficient but miscalibrated. It was not a dramatic turning point. It was a diagnostic event. U-96 was labeled ineffective because it did not behave as expected. HX-112 disintegrated because the system interpreting that behavior equated restraint with neutrality. The Atlantic campaign would eventually correct this misreading, but not before episodes like HX-112 revealed the limits of control in a contested environment governed by physics, logistics, and delayed understanding. As escort command absorbed the implications, a deeper pattern emerged. The convoy defense system had been calibrated to react to peaks, sudden detections, confirmed attacks, visible disruptions. It struggled with plateaus. U-96 operated on that plateau, where nothing appeared to happen, yet every hour increased leverage. This was not a psychological trick. It was arithmetic. Fuel burned. Batteries drained elsewhere. Crews rotated. Attention shifted. The ocean did not change. The system did. At the mechanical level, escort vessels assigned to HX-112 faced a fixed trade-off between speed and endurance. Sustained high-speed operations to prosecute contacts consumed fuel at rates that shortened on-station time. Slower patrol speeds preserved fuel but widened reaction windows. Neither option eliminated vulnerability. U-96's commander understood this without needing precise data. Changes in escort behavior, engine noise profiles, altered spacing, intermittent sweeps, signaled fuel management decisions. These signals were crude, but sufficient. The submarine's own limitations forced attentiveness to such details. The convoys routing further constrained response. HX-112 followed lanes selected to balance distance, weather, and coverage. Deviating significantly risked delays and collision hazards. Once engaged, escorts could not easily reposition the entire formation without compounding disorder. This rigidity became exploitable. U-96 did not need to penetrate the screen repeatedly. One disruption was enough to fracture cohesion. The technical anchor here was mass. Hundreds of thousands of tons of merchant shipping could not maneuver like a destroyer, no matter how well escorted. Internally, U-96 faced its own inflexible limits. Battery discharge curves were steep. Hull stress increased with depth and sea state. Periscope exposure carried detection risk. Reloading torpedoes under pressure required time and manpower. None of these favored prolonged combat. They favored singular, well-timed action. The boat's restraint was a consequence of design, not temperament. Effectiveness emerged when that design intersected with opposing constraints at the right moment. As analysts compared HX-112 with later engagements, they identified a recurring failure mode. Systems optimized to suppress aggression often create blind spots for patience. Escort command procedures emphasized response over denial. Once a submarine was assessed as inactive, denial relaxed. U-96 exploited that relaxation. It did not force the system open. It waited for it to open itself. This insight influenced subsequent convoy doctrine incrementally. Extended shadowing became more acceptable despite fuel costs. Air patrol integration increased to reduce reliance on surface escorts alone. Classification schemes were adjusted to treat persistent contacts as unresolved rather than neutralized. These changes reduced vulnerability but increased complexity. Every layer added new coordination demands. The Atlantic became more crowded with assets operating closer to their limits. HX-112 thus occupies a specific position in the evolution of the Atlantic War. It was not a decisive defeat, nor a singular triumph. It was an early signal that control in modern naval warfare is provisional. It depends on interpretation as much as detection. U-96 revealed that a submarine could remain dangerous without appearing aggressive, simply by operating precisely within known physical boundaries. The convoy disintegrated because its defense system assumed that danger would announce itself through action. U-96 demonstrated that danger could manifest through restraint. That lesson would echo repeatedly as the war continued. Whenever doctrine lagged behind the realities imposed by steel hulls, fuel tanks, batteries, and time. By early 1942, the analytical picture surrounding HX-112 had stabilized enough to influence planning beyond the immediate Atlantic theater. The event began appearing in internal summaries not as an anomaly, but as an example of systemic exposure under constrained resources. What mattered was not how U-96 attacked, but how long it remained relevant without attacking. That persistence strained escort assumptions more effectively than repeated contact ever could. At the command level, the failure revealed a mismatch between tactical reporting and operational reality. Contact logs emphasized discrete events, detections, attacks, evasions. U-96 produced none of these until the decisive moment. Its impact existed in the intervals between reports. Those intervals were invisible to systems built around event-driven analysis. The technical anchor here was reporting latency. Information moved slower than the environment it described. By the time a contact's significance was reassessed, conditions had already shifted. This gap between perception and reality widened under wartime pressure. Escort command operated under constant demand to protect multiple convoys simultaneously. Resources were finite. Decisions favored immediate threats because they offered measurable justification. A destroyer dispatched toward an active contact could be logged, reported, and defended. Fuel spent shadowing a silent submarine could not. U-96 exploited this incentive structure without ever interacting with it directly. Its restraint forced the system to reveal its own priorities. The physical environment reinforced these dynamics. North Atlantic weather degraded sensors unpredictably. Sea states fluctuated beyond forecast accuracy. Radar returns faded into noise. Astic beams scattered. Escorts compensated by adjusting speed and spacing, each adjustment carrying cost. U-96's commander did not need to predict these changes precisely. It was enough to recognize that variability itself limited escort certainty. The submarine's own limits demanded caution. That caution aligned with environmental uncertainty to create operational cover. When HX-112 finally fractured, the sequence appeared sudden to those inside the convoy. To analysts reconstructing the event later, it appeared gradual. Every preceding hour contributed. Escort fuel margins tightened. Formation rigidity increased. Attention shifted outward. None of these developments were dramatic. Together, they formed the conditions for collapse. U-96's role was to persist until those conditions converged. This convergence highlighted an uncomfortable truth about modern naval warfare. Control is inferred, not absolute. A convoy appears secure because its defenses are present and active. That appearance persists until a system encounters behavior it does not measure well. U-96 did not overwhelm the convoy's defenses. It exposed the limits of their measurement. The boat remained constrained by steel, batteries, and fuel. The convoy defense remained constrained by doctrine, logistics, and interpretation. Where those constraints overlapped, failure emerged. As the war continued, Allied forces adapted. Coverage expanded. Coordination improved. The margins that U-96 exploited narrowed. Yet the underlying principle did not disappear. Systems optimized for efficiency remain vulnerable to actors who understand the cost of certainty. HX-112 demonstrated this early, before adaptation fully caught up with reality. In historical scale, the episode sits between phases. It belongs neither to the early period of unopposed submarine success nor to the later phase of Allied dominance. It marks a transition where assumptions were challenged but not yet replaced. U-96 patrol did not change the outcome of the war. It changed how the war had to be understood. The Atlantic campaign would continue to balance detection against interpretation, coverage against endurance, and action against restraint. HX-112 remains instructive because it reveals how failure can arise without surprise, heroics, or overwhelming force. It emerges instead from the quiet interaction of limits, each rational in isolation, collectively decisive. HX-112 is best understood not as a dramatic episode of submarine warfare, but as a moment when the internal logic of an industrial system was briefly exposed. In 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had already become a contest between constraints rather than intentions. Steel hulls, fuel tanks, battery cells, sensor ranges, communication delays, and crew endurance defined what both sides could do long before doctrine or will enter the equation. U-96 did not escape those limits. It operated precisely inside them. What distinguished the episode was asymmetry in interpretation. Escort Command evaluated danger through visible activity because visible activity was measurable, reportable, and actionable. Silence, delay, and restraint resisted categorization. They did not fit neatly into contact logs or priority tables. Yet in a system governed by endurance and time, restraint was not neutral. It was cumulative. Every hour U-96 remained relevant without attacking reduced escort flexibility elsewhere. Every fuel calculation made in response to other threats increased rigidity around HX-112. The convoy's apparent stability masked a gradual loss of options. In historical scale, this pattern repeats across modern warfare. As systems grow more complex, they rely increasingly on abstraction to function at all. Abstraction simplifies decision-making, but it also creates blind spots. HX-112 demonstrates how those blind spots can be exploited without violating any known physical or technical boundary. U-96 did not innovate tactically. It adhered to the realities of its design: limited battery endurance, finite torpedo supply, vulnerability on the surface. The convoy defense adhered to its own realities: fuel scarcity, sensor limitations, communication latency, and the need to prioritize. The collapse of HX-112 was therefore not the failure of a ship or a crew. It was the failure of alignment between measurement and reality. The system assumed that danger would manifest through action. It did not account for danger expressed through timing. By the time that misalignment became visible, the conditions that sustained the convoy had already eroded. As the Atlantic War progressed, Allied forces adapted. Air coverage closed gaps. Radar reduced uncertainty. Escort coordination improved. The operational space that allowed such restraint-driven exploitation narrowed. But those adaptations came later, informed in part by episodes like HX-112. The lesson was absorbed gradually, at cost, through repeated friction between doctrine and environment. U-96 did not change the outcome of the war. It clarified something more durable. In environments governed by physics and logistics, control is provisional. Systems appear stable until the assumptions that support them quietly expire. HX-112 endures as a reminder that in industrial warfare, effectiveness is not always loud, and failure is not always sudden. Sometimes it arrives through silence, patience, and the disciplined use of limits that everyone believed they already understood.